In 2024, Syria fell. Hezbollah and Hamas also lost many of their top leaders. These are major blows to their resistance against the US-Israeli domination of West Asia. Iran has lost an important ally, namely Syria, which might also impact its ability to effectively collaborate with Hezbollah and the Palestinian resistance. Moreover, the Iranian rial continues to lose its value and inflation keeps rising. So, many are asking, what is next for Iran? Will the country continue to support Palestine and the resistance, or will it take a different approach? We'll take a look in this episode. Iran has a diverse political landscape. The Islamic Republic has a sizable social base that is committed to the politics of difference. They're willing to pay a cost for Iran to choose an alternative path that goes against Western cultural hegemony and US political interests in the region. But there's also another demographic, also sizable, that isn't so much interested in all of this. They just want to give up their resistance and be a normal country. They'd rather Iran be a place like Dubai or even Mohammed bin Salman's Saudi Arabia. And then there are groups in between. The desires of the so-called normal Iranians was showcased by an AI-generated video which went semi-viral on Instagram and TikTok. The video took elements from real life and combined it with AI. It showed what Iran could look like if it were not for the politics of the Islamic Republic and the resulting US sanctions.
After 46 years,
U.S. embassy reopens in Tehran.
all Iranian people have access to Starlink satellite internet.
Iran has the world's most powerful military.
Quick was recognized as the safest car in the world.
Bank interest rates in Iran became completely zero.
Clothing choices in Iran became free.
The price of $1 became equal to one Iranian toman.
The most expensive series in the world was made in Iran.
Cyrus the Great.
Popular artists returned to Iran one after another.
McDonald's opens in Iran.
Global brands competed to enter the Iranian
A
market.
dedicated stadium was built for Esteghlal.
Zidane became the coach of tractor Sazi Tabri.
Persepolis won the Asian Championship.
Iran became the #1 tourist destination in 2025.
AI Ali reached 5 million followers.
Javad Azati won the 2025 Oscar.
Iranian scientists brought Haideh back to life using artificial intelligence.
Military service in Iran became optional with high pay.
Messi returned to Barcelona.
The game GTA 6 was finally released.
Now, the original poster might have had somewhat ironic intentions, but what the video shows is actually what many Iranians want Iran to be like. In this episode, we want to focus on a particular subset of the anti-resistance demographic, those who are pretty westward looking. They think Iranians would have way better lives if they gave a cold shoulder to countries like Russia and China and got along with America. Or if you want to put it more boldly and honestly, just went along with what the US asked of them. The West-looking demographic has deep roots in Iranian culture. In the 19th century, when European colonialism reached the height of its power, it sent shockwaves through the colonized world. And faced with this shock and awe, a lot of colonized intellectuals developed a two-sided relationship with Europe. On the one hand, they wanted to end colonialism. On the other hand, they thought that becoming like Europe, not just in technology or military organization, but even in culture, would help them progress and become free and independent of Europe. It was kind of like creating a vaccine when you use the very virus that causes a disease to build protection against the disease. Iran's westward-looking intellectual culture took off in the second half of the 19th century. This was a time when Iranians were living in a world which, from their perspective, was increasingly insecure and confusing. Iran lost territory to the Russian Tsar Empire in the early 19th century, then lost Herat in present-day Afghanistan to the British in 1857. It wasn't just the ruling political elite that experienced insecurity. With pressure from the global capitalistic economy, local crafts and industries began to decline too, spreading a sense of insecurity throughout the larger segments of the country.
The 19th century was a period of crisis for Persia. The royal dynasty in charge, the Qajars, had lost 2 wars early on to the Russian Empire, losing Armenia and Azerbaijan in the process. In the east, the Afghans had cemented their rule over the city of Herat. Whilst their adversaries, the Ottomans, were instituting reforms to streamline their administration, the Qajars were falling behind, with their governance model relying on a highly decentralized system that was prone to extreme corruption. Ordinary Persians were not oblivious to their government's ineffectiveness, especially since European imperial powers were imposing their will and domination on the country. In 1872, Nasir al-Din Shah Qajar signed a contract with Paul Reuter, a British businessman and founder of Reuters news agency, that saw the Iranian ruler concede control over Persian roads, factories, extraction of resources, amongst other things, in exchange for 60% of net revenue and a fixed sum. British statesman Lord Curzon called it the most complete and extraordinary surrender of the entire industrial resources of a kingdom into foreign hands that has probably ever been dreamed of, much less accomplished in history. Thankfully for Iran, public outrage reached the point that the Shah was forced to back down.
The intellectuals were unhappy with the government's slow pace of response to these weaknesses, so they began to come up with the new ideas on how Iranians ought to manage their affairs. Admiration for Europe became a major current behind these ideas, and the intellectuals didn't simply sit at an armchair admiring Europe based on what they had read. Many of them had lived and experienced European countries firsthand, and also the United States. Various Iranian governments sent students abroad to study. Many of them returned to Iran and took up roles as intellectual administrators. They attempted to implement what they had learned about and from Europe. Although some who could afford it did travel with their own funds. One of the earliest self-funded travelers to Europe was Haj Sayyah. Not wanting to marry his cousin, Haj Sayyah left Iran and began his travel in the year 1860. Based on his travels, Haj Sayyah authored a travel log that effectively presented Europe as a utopia to his Iranian peers. Looking to the first also found very exaggerated forms, like the famous quotation from Hassan Taqizadeh, who was an Islamic seminarian student turned tie-wearing intellectual. In 1920, Taqizadeh advised his fellow Iranians that all patriotic Persians should exert themselves to promote literally with all their strength and should place before everything else the adaptation and promotion without condition or reservation of European civilization and the assimilation of the culture, customs, practices, organization, sciences, arts, life, and the whole attitude of Europe. And looking westwards wasn't limited to liberal intellectuals. Marxist intellectual Taqi Arani also wrote that despite what some fossilized Iranians thought, progress laid with Europe and the United States, which Iran needed to follow. And there was this larger trend in Iranian nationalism. This trend held that Iranians had more in common with Europe than they did with their neighbors. Using racial European ideas, a number of intellectuals presented Iran as an Aryan nation that was somehow separated from its fellow Aryans in Europe. These intellectuals believed Iranians were once great like modern Europeans when they had a vast empire. And then the Arabs and Islam came to Iran, causing its decline and weakness. This Aryanist idea was less based on evidence from the empire Cyrus the Great ruled over and more influenced by modern European racial concepts. It essentially confused a linguistic category, namely the Indo-European languages, which include both Persian and European languages, with racial, cultural, and civilizational commonality between Iranians and Europeans. The Aryanist myth is why every time there's a German tourist in Iran, Iranians embarrass themselves by talking about their common Aryan ancestry, or treat the Germans as some sort of superior race who share the same genes with them. I'm also sure you have encountered Iranians in the diaspora who hate being confused with Arabs and who keep telling you that they're actually white.
به نظرتون ما شبیه کدوم کشور هستیم؟
شبیه آلمانیایی من در قیافه با ایتالیایی فکر کنم. قیافه رگمون یه چیزی هست.
So Iranians do confuse themselves with white people, but also Iranian intellectuals wanted to become like white people in how they lived, their everyday life. The famous Berlin-based novelist Muhammad Ali Jamalzadeh made frequent references to German order and discipline as models for Iranian social life. He once wrote that when it was still completely dark in Germany, children were forced to leave their warm bed and go to school. So he wondered why Iranians were so relaxed with time and would sometimes begin instructions in the afternoon. Many intellectuals thought that if Iranians became disciplined like Germans, they would become rich and developed. And these weren't just ideas, they also became a real political project. During the 1930s, the Pahlavi estate equated progress with the Westernization of culture and clothing. This included the notorious unveiling of women by the police between January of 1936 and Reza Shah's abdication in 1941, which generated a lot of public protest. It probably also impacted the reaction of the Islamic government in the 1980s to do the very opposite and impose mandatory veiling.
The first and last Reza Shah's foreign visit was his travel to Turkey to meet Ataturk. During his stay there, he confronted remarkable differences between Turkey and his own land. The most important one was the women's contribution in the society. This travel led to some reforms in Iran, which were so challenging but warranted the active presence of women in social environment. One of the most disputable ones was in 1936 when Reza Shah passed a decree to restrict hijab. Many social disobediences took place while many people accepted the new dress code. Reza Shah's family appeared without hijab for the first time in the society. This law made a crisis, causing some religious people capturing their female family members at home.
Thousands of people gathered at the mosque. Soon, military police surrounded the mosque. The military stated that if people did not disperse within one day, violent action would be taken. The military ordered the crowd to disperse, but the people did not obey. Therefore, the military broke into the Gohar Shah mosque, killing dozens of people inside the mosque. The next day, the army of Sheikh Bahlul killed 20 Iranian soldiers and took their weapons. Within just one day, all troops stationed in Mashhad had fled the city. However, this rebellion was soon crushed by the military when Reza Shah sent reinforcements. Soldiers entered the city and massacred around 5,000 people in Mashhad. The following day, the dead were buried in mass graves, and most of the senior scholars in the city were arrested and exiled from Mashhad.
Now all of these intellectuals pretty much ignored the darker side of the West. They didn't show that much interest in the massive labor exploitation of industrial capitalism or the genocide and dispossession of native peoples. In fact, a lot of intellectuals just read what the Europeans had to say about the native people in the Americas and reproduced them in Iranian and Persian papers. This passage from the late 1800s issue of a reformist paper called Akhtar is quite striking. The author wrote about Native Americans. In reality, the state of the American savage is not without eccentricity. For 400 years, the light of European civilization and science illuminated the land of America, and the awesomeness and knowledge flew in all directions. But this bunch of thorough savages remain in their prison of ignorance and darkness. No one knows what has caused this horrid state in them, but surely they were created without the ability of cultivating the land, breeding of animals, and other traits of pastoral and agricultural life. Of course, there were many exceptions, meaning those who wanted reform and change, but did not obsess over what the West had accomplished. In fact, the modernist intellectual Ahmad Kasravi ridiculed his peers, writing that, "We've lost our brains, and for right and wrong, there is no measure other than having been to Europe. To prove anything, you must reference some monsieur or some madam, or your words won't be accepted." Another famous example who went against the zeitgeist of his time was Muhammad Taqi Bahar, Iran's last poet laureate. He wrote several poems in solidarity with Iran's colonized neighbors and directed scathing criticisms at the British and the Europeans for their colonial crimes. In one poem by the title of Warning to Europe, he warned, "The dagger of your tyranny pierced Asian hearts. O Europe, another turn for Asia comes." Oh, and here I must add something in parenthesis. It is another turn for all of Asia. Outside the US and in most of Asia itself, Asian refers to everyone from the continent of Asia, not just somebody who's East Asian. But overall, reformist intellectuals were more deferential to Europe than they were critical of it. It is easy to blame them from our vantage point when decolonial ideas have become fashionable, but they live in a world that had just experienced the trauma of colonialism. So it just seemed more alluring to identify with the aggressor instead of rejecting him. Even after the post-World War II decolonization movements and the Islamic Revolution in Iran in the year 1979, the interest in the West has lived on, which is a major reason why it's difficult to bring the country together when it comes to the politics of resistance. In fact, a sizable portion of Iranians seem less mad about the US policies towards Iran that is bringing a major toll on the economy. Instead, they're mad that their Arab neighbors for calling the Persian Gulf the Gulf, or they're angry with China and Russia alleging that China and Russia are colonizing Iran. The Netherlands-based group for analyzing and measuring attitudes in Iran, also called Gaman, has some revealing data about this issue. 52% of those surveyed said to have a positive view of the USA, compared with 25% positive view of Russia and 27% positive view of China. So the favorability view of the US is about twice as much. Not to mention that 71% of Iranians oppose the Iran-China 25-year cooperation agreement and 66% oppose the 20-year cooperation treaty between Iran and Russia. Although these surveys had some problems in method, for example being conducted online, they're pretty consistent with my everyday experience talking to average people in Iran. So it makes sense why the fantasy AI video was so joyful over the access of Iranians to a US embassy, an official Apple store, and well, the American stable cuisine, McDonald's. A lot of these perceptions have to do with an emotional reaction to the bad state of the economy, which means that the people want to oppose the official government position. But they also have to do with the lack of investment in the humanities, which results in low levels of political education. And of course, the foreign-funded misinformation that targets Iranian on the daily. The US often claims that its population is the victim of misinformation from its enemies, such as Russia. And of course, they also claim that China is spreading misinformation in America.
Data is stored here in American soil.
Your TikTok employees that live in China, they must cooperate with Chinese intelligence whenever they are called upon. And if they are called upon, they're bound to secrecy. That would include you. So, Mr. Chu, if the CCP tells ByteDance to turn over all data that TikTok has collected inside the US, even within Project Texas, do they have to do so, according to Chinese law?
Congressman, first, I'm Singaporean.
But people in the global south are much more vulnerable to the misinformation for two major reasons. One is they don't have as much control over the creation and distribution of information. After all, the US government and companies control most of the major social media platforms. And they also seize anything that is hosted on a .com domain if they want to. And two, because of Western cultural hegemony. An Iranian is much more likely to watch CNN or BBC than an American is likely to watch Russia Today. So a lot of Iranians suffering from bad economic prospects and consuming a lot of misinformation are aching for the ability to become a normal place like Dubai. But what the AI video doesn't show is the cost of political sovereignty. For the US to lift sanctions and for foreigners to come and invest in Iran, Iran would have to give up a lot of sovereignty it has built over the years. The US wouldn't just trust Iran to behave after 45 years of resisting imperialism and causing trouble in the region. So say tomorrow Reza Pahlavi, the crown prince, returns to the throne, the US and Israel would still find ways to sabotage Iran, kind of similar to what Israel has done to Syria in recent weeks. The freedom through Apple, McDonald's, and beautiful football stadiums many Iranians seek might take off some economic pressure in the short term, and it might generate some wealth in the country. But it could also bring about greater class inequality, worse than what we already have today. And also the rule by a pragmatic military capitalistic elite who cares neither for people's participation in politics nor for the country's sovereignty. As long as they have nice contracts with multinational corporations and become rich themselves, they would be content. But we shouldn't overstate the power of the West-leaning Iranians. There's also a strong anti-imperialist current in the country who are more interested in regenerating the axis of resistance, neutralizing the sanctions, and speeding up the potential move towards a multipolar world order. And there are also groups that feed neither the vision of the AI video nor the hard resistance approach that comes with a great cost to the economy. We hope to cover both trends more in future episodes. The battle between Iran's political ideologies, or perhaps a compromise between them, will guide the future.
Are you willing now to have direct, open talks with Washington, with President Trump, ما مشکلمون با گفتگو نی.
Problem we have is not in dialogue, it's in the commitments that arise from talk and dialogue that we'll have to commit to. We held talks with 5+1, lengthy talks, and we upheld all the commitments that we had to commit to. But unfortunately, it was the other party that did not live up to its promises and obligations.